No moon hung over the canyon. The valley drowned in smoke. Fire climbed the barn walls in sheets of orange, swallowing the panicked screams of horses still trapped inside. Dark shapes on horseback raced the perimeter, guns cracking into the night one after another. A slight figure pressed hard against the cold stone of the well, rifle raised high, the barrel trembling in the heat, but never dropping. Someone had already fired first. A rider toppled from the saddle. Blood darkened the dirt beneath him. Smoke thickened. Flames climbed higher still. Fresh hoofbeats thundered from the canyon gate, closer this time, faster, more of them. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. In the short, breathless silence between gunshots, a single voice carried on the wind, almost calm. "They're coming for what's buried under our feet." Missouri Territory, 1863. The rain had not stopped in 3 days. Not a drizzle. Not the kind that passes. The kind that fills rivers until rivers forget their banks. The kind that takes a man in his sleep and a barn before breakfast and a whole life before the sun comes up to see what's left. The war back east had already emptied half the territory of able men, and the roads that remained belonged to whoever was hard enough to walk them. Adeline Calder walked into Copperline covered in mud that could not hide the bruises underneath. Mud on her hands, mud on her hem, mud in the creases of a wedding ring, so tarnished you had to tilt it toward the light just to remember it was gold. She was 26 years old. She looked 50, because that's what a flood does. It doesn't just take your husband. It takes the years you were supposed to have with him and hands you someone else's face to wear instead. The cabin was gone. The sheep were gone. Even the grave she tried to dig with her own hands, gone, because the ground turned to soup before she could get him under it properly. Which meant she'd left him. Which meant some nights, when she closed her eyes, all she could see was water closing over a shape that used to answer to her voice. She didn't cry walking into town. She was past that. Copperline wasn't the kind of place that welcomed strangers. Crooked buildings, suspicious eyes, a cattle town wedged into canyon rock like it had been dropped there and left to fend for itself. The men were hard, the women were harder, and nobody gave a damn about your story unless it came wrapped in money or beef. She made it as far as the general store. Then the street tilted. Then everything went dark. She woke up in a back room that smelled like tobacco and mildew and old regret. A thin blanket over her, thrown more out of obligation than kindness. Her ribs ached in a way that suggested they hadn't forgiven her. Yet for the last 3 days, a woman sat in the corner, arms crossed, watching her the way you'd watch a stray dog. The kind that might have rabies. The kind you feel bad about not helping right up until you don't. "You got people here?" Adeline shook her head. "Money." Another shake. The woman sighed, stood, brushed her skirt like Adeline's misfortune might be catching. "Then you can't stay. We got enough problems without taking in charity cases." "I can work." The words came out like gravel scraped off a road. "Cleaning, cooking, mending, anything. You can barely stand." "I'll get stronger." The woman studied her. And there it was, that flicker Adeline had learned to recognize on sight now. Pity. Right before the door closes. Because pity doesn't feed you. Pity doesn't keep the cold out at night. Pity just makes people feel better about walking away. "There's a boarding house 2 streets down," the woman said finally. "Mrs. Whitfield runs it. Tell her Opal sent you." Adeline tried to stand. Swayed. Caught the wall. Nobody caught her. She limped out the door, and every step was an argument with her own body about whether continuing was worth the trouble. Mrs. Whitfield's boarding house leaned to the left, like it too was trying to escape its own foundation. The woman who opened the door looked Adeline up and down with all the warmth of a tax collector on a bad Tuesday. "Opal sent me," Adeline said. "I need work. You look half dead." "I'm stronger than I look. Everyone says that." A pause, cold and assessing. "You got references?" "No." Experience. I kept house. For my husband. Before. Adeline stopped. Because talking about it wouldn't change anything. Because the words got stuck somewhere behind her teeth every single time. Before what? Before he died. Something shifted in Mrs. Whitfield's face. Not sympathy. Satisfaction. The satisfaction of having guessed correctly. Recent? 3 weeks. And you're already out here looking for work instead of mourning proper. Mrs. Whitfield shook her head like she'd tasted something sour. That'll start tongues wagging. But I suppose I could use someone for the laundry. $2 a week. Meals included. You sleep in the cellar. $2. It was nothing. It was everything. I'll take it. The cellar had a cot, a bucket, a grated window that let in just enough light to see the mold creeping up the walls like it, too, was looking for a way out. But it was shelter. It was something. She started the next morning, and the work was brutal in the way that work is brutal, when it's the only thing standing between you and starving. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles split, hauled water until her shoulders screamed, washed sheets stained with things she made a point of not thinking about. There were 2 other women who worked the house. Sisters. They kept their distance, spoke to her only when necessary, never held eye contact for more than a breath. By the end of the first week, Adeline understood why. Because the rumors had already started. She heard them in pieces, whispers that cut off the second she entered a room. The widow who showed up right when the McAllister cattle started dying. The stranger covered in bruises, who brought the bad luck with her wherever she went. The cursed woman who probably killed her own husband and ran before anyone could prove it. None of it was true. Didn't matter. In a town like Copperline, truth was whatever story stuck first. The cattle thing was a sick cow that had infected the herd. Anyone with 2 working eyes could see that. But Adeline arrived the same week, and that apparently was proof enough. When old man McAllister's barn burned down 2 nights later, she felt the shift in the street. Saw mothers pull their skirts tighter around their children when she walked past. Watched men who used to nod at her now look through her like she was made of smoke. She kept her head down. She worked harder. She told herself it would blow over. Didn't. The first real trouble came on a Saturday night, carrying a basket of clean laundry back from the creek. 3 men blocked her path. She recognized one, a ranch hand, who stayed at the boarding house sometimes. Always drunk, always looking for someone to bleed his frustrations onto. Tobias Renner. Well, Renner grinned, missing half his teeth. If it isn't the witch herself. She tried to step around him. He moved with her. I'm just trying to get back to work, she said quietly. Hear that, boys? She's trying to work. Like she's normal folk. He leaned in, whiskey breath hot and sour. My cousin lost half his herd this month. You know anything about that? No. Funny how all this bad luck started right when you showed up. I don't want any trouble. Too late for that, witch. He shoved her. Not hard enough to knock her down. Hard enough to make the basket tilt. Hard enough that the other men laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd seen all week. One of them kicked the basket, scattered clean sheets into the dirt. Adeline's hands clenched, because getting angry would only make it worse. Because she'd learned that lesson already, hadn't she? Learned it in 100 small ways, since the flood took everything soft out of the world, and left only this. Only men like this, only nights like this. She bent to gather the sheets. Renner kicked dirt in her face. She coughed, eyes watering, and that's when his boot caught her ribs. Not a full kick. Tap. The kind of casual violence men like Renner handed out for entertainment. Like she was a thing to be tapped, not a person to be reckoned with. She went down hard, tasted blood and mud at the same time. That's where you belong, Renner said. In the dirt with the rest of the garbage. They walked away laughing. She lay there a long time, listening to her own breathing, waiting to see if it would keep going without her permission. It did. Eventually she got up, gathered the sheets, carried them back, washed them again in silence, while the sisters pretended not to notice the bruises blooming across her face like something rotten under the skin. Mrs. Whitfield said nothing, which meant she'd heard, which meant everyone had heard, which meant it would happen again. It did. Over the next 2 weeks, Adeline was tripped in the street. Refused service at the butcher. Someone poured spoiled milk into her wash bin. Someone smashed the small window of her cellar room while she slept, and she woke to glass in her hair and cold air pouring in like the night itself wanted a piece of her. The sisters stopped speaking to her entirely. Mrs. Whitfield started finding fault in everything, docking her pay for mistakes that didn't exist except in the woman's head. Adeline stopped fighting, stopped responding, just worked and survived, and tried badly to become invisible. It didn't help, because that's the thing about being a town scapegoat. It gives everyone permission. The men who beat their wives could blame it on the curse. The merchants who cheated their customers could point at bad luck instead of their own thumb on the scale. Every accident, every petty grievance, all of it landed at her feet until she wasn't a person anymore. She was just a story people told each other to feel better about themselves. She thought about leaving, thought about it every single night in that moldy cellar, counting coins that never added up to enough. But there was nowhere to go. Copperline sat surrounded by hard country on every side, and with the war on, the roads further out were said to be worse than the town itself. Without a horse, without supplies, she'd die in the open before she reached another town. So she stayed, and endured, and waited for something, anything, to change. It changed on a sweltering afternoon in late summer, during the cattle auction. The biggest day on Copperline's calendar. Ranchers and buyers pouring in, from 3 counties over, men who'd stayed behind, from the war to keep herds fed, and fences standing, and who guarded that exemption with a particular fierce pride. The main street a chaos of penned cattle, and shouting men, and the particular electric hum of a town that had money moving through it for once. Adeline had been sent to deliver clean linens to visiting ranchers staying at the boarding house, arms full, trying to navigate a street that had turned into a river of bodies and noise. She didn't see Renner until it was too late, drunker than usual, face red and mean. He stumbled out of the saloon with 2 friends, and his eyes lit up the second he spotted her. Like she was a prize he'd been waiting all day to collect. "Look who it is," loud enough for half the street to turn. The Copperline curse herself. She tried to keep walking. He stepped directly into her path. "Where you going, witch? Off to hex some more cattle? Please." Her voice was quiet, small. She hated how small. "I'm just trying to work." "You're trying to ruin this town is what you're doing." He grabbed the linens, threw them into the dirt. "Everything you touch turns to rot." She bent to pick them up. He kicked her hands away. "Leave them. I need those. I said leave them." This time when he shoved her, it wasn't a tap. It was real force. She went sprawling backward, hit the ground hard enough to knock the air clean out of her lungs. The street went quiet. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear fabric rustling, dozens of people turning to watch. Nobody moved to help. Renner stood over her, grinning like a man who'd finally gotten what he'd been owed. "Stay down where you belong, witch." And that's when Adeline felt it. That thing inside her that had been bending and bending for weeks, for months, maybe her whole life if she was honest, which she rarely was, not about this. That thing finally hit the bottom of its bend. She looked up at him, through the hair falling across her face. And for the first time, since the flood took everything soft out of her, she felt something other than fear. Rage. Clean as a knife blade. Renner must have seen it because his grin faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. "You got something to say?" Question now. Not a taunt. An honest question, because something in her face had rearranged the whole moment, without her permission. She opened her mouth, and a voice cut through the silence like thunder splitting a canyon in half. "That's enough." Every head turned. A man walked through the crowd. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty black, hat pulled low against the sun. Adeline didn't recognize him, but everyone else did, because the crowd stepped back, made way, without being asked. Renner straightened, swagger returning like a reflex. "This ain't your business, Reeve. You're making a scene at my auction." The man's voice was quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse, made the hair rise on Adeline's arms. "That makes it my business. She's cursed. Everyone knows. She's half your size." Cashas Reeve stopped a few feet away, looked down at Renner with an expression carved out of stone. "And you put her on the ground in front of 100 people. That how you feel? Proud? Everyone knows what she is." "Just what?" "Just proving you're a man by beating on someone who can't hit back." Renner's face flushed red. He looked around, realized too late that he'd lost the room, tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Reeve. Everyone knows. You got no right. I got every right. This is my town during auction week. My rules." Cashas's hand rested near his belt. Didn't touch the revolver. Didn't need to. The threat was clear enough without it. "And my rule is you don't hit women in my sight. Ever." Silence. "Apologize," Cashas said. "What?" "You heard me. Apologize to the lady. She's not a—" "Now." The word cracked like a whip. Renner flinched. For one long second Adeline thought he might do something stupid, might try to escalate this into something worse. But whatever the whiskey had lent him wasn't enough to hold up against Cashas Reeve. "Sorry," Renner mumbled. Not looking at her. Louder. "I said I'm sorry. Get out of my sight." Renner practically ran. His friends followed. The crowd dispersed back, into its business. And within moments it was just Adeline on the ground, and Cashas standing, over her unreadable. He held out his hand. She stared at it. Because in her experience, when a man offered help, there was always a price waiting behind it. Always something he wanted back. But she also knew she couldn't sit in the dirt forever. Slowly, she took his hand. His grip was calloused, strong. He pulled her up without apparent effort, then released her immediately and stepped back, giving her room. "You hurt." She tested her weight. Everything ached. Nothing felt broken. "I'll be fine. That's not what I asked." "I've had worse." Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or disgust. She couldn't tell if it was aimed at her or at the situation, and it didn't much matter which. He bent down, gathered the scattered linens, shook the dirt off, handed them back. "Thank you," she said quietly. He studied her a long moment. Dark eyes, unreadable under the brim of his hat. Then he did something that surprised her. He took his hat off, held it against his chest. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you had to experience that in my town." Nobody had called her ma'am in months. Nobody had apologized for anything since she'd arrived. "It's not your fault," she managed. "Isn't it?" He put the hat back on. "I own half the land around here. I employ half the men. If I wanted this place civilized, it would be—" A pause. "What's your name?" "Adeline. Adeline Calder." "Mrs. Calder, then?" A nod, formal in a way that felt strange in this rough country. "You got anyone in town? Family? Friends?" "No." "Where are you staying?" "The boarding house." "They treating you well there?" She almost laughed. Didn't, because lying seemed pointless. "Same as everyone else here." His jaw tightened. He looked away, toward the pens, the auction, the business waiting for him. She expected him to make some excuse. Walk off. That's what people did. Helped just enough to feel good about themselves, then left before it cost them anything real. Instead, he looked back. "How long you been in Copperline?" 6 weeks. "And in those 6 weeks, how many times has something like this happened?" She didn't answer. Didn't need to. He could see it. In the layers of bruises at different stages of healing. In the way she held herself like someone bracing for the next blow. "Right?" He said it soft. Then louder. "Mrs. Calder, I'm gonna ask you something. And I want you to know you can say no. I'll respect it, but I'm going to ask anyway, because I think we might be able to help each other. Her stomach tightened. Here it comes, she thought. The price. I'm listening, she said carefully. I need a wife. Of all the things she'd braced herself for. Not that. She took a step back. Sure, she'd misheard. What? I need a wife. Calm. Like he was discussing the weather. Not for anything improper. I have a ranch. Good land. Isolated. 3 hours out by horse over hard country. I had a housekeeper. She quit last month. Said it was too lonely. He paused. Truth is, it's also dangerous. I have enemies. Men who'd like to see me fail. Or worse. A woman alone out there puts her at risk. But a wife. He stopped. Reconsidered. A wife is different. Protected by law. And custom. Anyone who knows me knows I take care of what's mine. Her mind was reeling. You don't even know me. I know you survived 6 weeks in this town as a target. I know you just got beaten in the street and got back up anyway. I know you're willing to work hard, because women don't last a week doing laundry for Ada Whitfield, unless they're tougher than they look. He met her eyes. And I know you have nowhere else to go. That part hit like a fist, because it was true, because he could see it as clearly as everyone else could. Maybe more clearly. This is crazy, she said. Maybe, but it's also practical. You need safety. I need someone to run a large property and keep house. We could help each other. You could hire someone, put an ad in the paper. Tried. Like I said, most women don't want to live that far from civilization. And with the war on, there's fewer hands to spare for asking twice. He shook his head. I need someone with spine. Someone who won't run at the first sign of trouble. How do you know I won't run? Because you haven't yet. She looked around the street, at the people pretending not to stare, at the town that had chewed her up and spat her back out, and still, somehow, wasn't finished. What exactly would you expect from this arrangement? She asked slowly. I'd expect you to help run the household. Cooking, some cleaning, managing supplies. In return, you'd have a roof, food, safety, respect. A pause. I won't touch you. That's not what this is about. Why not? Because I had a wife once. Loved her more than breath. She died 5 years ago, and took that part of me with her. I'm not looking to replace her. I'm looking for a partnership. Someone capable I can trust. And if I want to leave, then you leave. I'm not looking for a prisoner, Mrs. Calder. I'm looking for help. If it doesn't work, you go your own way. With enough money to start fresh somewhere. It was the most insane proposal she'd ever heard. Marry a stranger. Move to an isolated ranch. Keep house for a man with enemies she didn't know, and history she couldn't guess at. Everything logical in her screamed no. Except everything logical had also told her she could make it work in Copperline. If she just kept her head down, worked hard. That hadn't gone so well, had it? I need time to think, she said. You have until sundown tomorrow. Auction ends then. After that, I head back to the ranch. He tipped his hat. Mrs. Whitfield knows where to find me if you decide. He turned, walked away, moving back toward the pens, where men were already flagging him down with questions. Adeline stood there, holding the dirty linens, watching him go, trying to figure out if she'd just been offered salvation, or signed herself up for a different kind of hell. That night, she lay awake in the cellar and tried to think about it rationally. The smart move was obviously to say no. You didn't marry strange men. You didn't agree to isolation with someone you'd known for one afternoon. You didn't trust an offer like that, especially not from a man powerful enough that the whole town stepped aside when he walked through it. But rational thinking had gotten her here, sleeping in a moldy cellar, waiting for the next time someone decided to use her as a punching bag. What did she actually know about Cashas Reeve? He was rich, influential. People feared him or respected him or both in equal measure. He'd stepped in when he didn't have to, offered help without asking for anything back, not yet, anyway. Maybe that was the trap. Maybe he was just more sophisticated than Renner. Knew how to play the long game. Get her isolated on his ranch, where nobody could hear her scream. Except if that's what he wanted, there were easier targets. Women without her particular notoriety. Women who wouldn't be missed. The thought made her stomach turn. Is that what she'd become? Someone who wouldn't be missed. She rolled over, stared at the moldy wall, thought about her husband, about the life they'd built, about the flood that took it all in one night and left her holding a ring too tarnished to reflect anything back at her. She'd loved him. He'd been kind. He died anyway, and kindness hadn't saved him, hadn't saved her, hadn't done one single thing except leave her alone in a world that ate people like her for breakfast. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe she'd been trying to survive on kindness, when what she actually needed was something harder, something sharp enough to cut back. Or maybe she was just exhausted and desperate, looking for reasons to justify a terrible decision, because the alternative was another year of Tobias Renner's boot in her ribs. The next day crawled past. She worked in a daze, scrubbing floors, hauling water, her mind spinning in circles that never landed anywhere solid. Mrs. Whitfield watched her with narrow eyes, like she could smell something coming. "You thinking about leaving?" the older woman asked around noon. Adeline was elbow-deep in wash water. Didn't look up. "Why would you think that?" "Because Cashas Reeve talked to you yesterday, and now you've got that look. The one people get right before they do something stupid." "Would you care if I left?" Mrs. Whitfield snorted. "Not particularly. You've been nothing but trouble since you showed up." A pause. "But I'll give you one piece of advice anyway, free of charge." Adeline waited. "Cashas Reeve is a hard man. Killed 7 men that I know of. Probably more he didn't talk about. His first wife died under circumstances nobody likes to discuss. His ranch is 3 hours from anything civilized, and the men who work for him are loyal because they're paid well. And because they're scared of him." She paused. "If you're thinking of taking up with him, you better be sure you know what you're signing up for. And if I stay here, then you'll probably be dead within the year. Renner's not the only one who'd like to see you gone permanent." She shrugged, as if that settled it. Quick death or slow one. It wasn't much of a recommendation for either. As the sun sank toward the horizon, Adeline made her decision. Not because it was smart, not because she was sure, because staying guaranteed more of the same, and she'd finally reached the point where uncertainty looked better than certain suffering. She found Cashas at the hotel in a private room where he was conducting business with 2 men who quieted the second she walked in. "Mrs. Calder," he stood. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I have questions." "Fair enough. Ask them." She stepped inside, very aware of the door closing behind her, of being alone with him for the first time in a room instead of the middle of a crowded street. Up close, she noticed details she'd missed before. A scar along his jaw, gray threading through dark hair, eyes that looked simultaneously weary and watchful like a man who never stopped scanning a room even when he was standing still in it. "Why me?" she asked. "You could marry anyone. Someone from a good family. Someone without my reputation." "I could." He didn't hesitate. "But good families come with expectations. Politics. Obligations. I don't want any of that. I want someone practical. Someone who understands that life is hard and doesn't need protecting from that fact." "What happened to your first wife?" His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Childbirth. The baby didn't make it either." He stopped. "We were too far from a doctor. By the time I understood how bad it was." He stopped again. Started over. "I loved her. Wasn't a good husband. But I loved her. Her death is my fault for bringing her out there in the first place." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She'd expected excuses, deflection. Not this. "And you want to do it again? Bring another woman out there?" "No." Firm. "I want to be honest about what that life is. I want someone who chooses it with her eyes open, instead of romantic notions about ranch life. He met her gaze. You've been ground down by this town. I've been ground down by guilt. Maybe we're both broken enough to be practical with each other. It wasn't a love story. It wasn't even particularly hopeful. But it was honest. And honesty was something Adeline had precious little of lately. If I say yes, she said slowly, and it turns out you're lying, that you want something I'm not willing to give, then you kill me. He said it simply, like it was the most reasonable arrangement in the world. I'll teach you to shoot, teach you the land. If I cross a line, put a bullet in me. There's a marshal 3 counties over. You ride there, tell him I attacked you, he'll believe it. Half the territory would throw a party. She stared at him. You're serious. Completely. You're not a good man, are you? No. He said it without flinching. But I keep my word. If I say I won't touch you, I won't. And if I'm lying, a shrug. Then you do what you have to do to survive. That's all any of us can do. It was the most pragmatic, least romantic proposal imaginable, which somehow made it more believable than any flowery promise ever could have. All right, she said. I'll do it. He nodded once, like they'd just concluded a business deal, which in a way they had. We'll marry tomorrow morning before I leave. I'll have papers drawn up tonight. Bring whatever you want to keep. I don't have much. Then it won't take long to pack. And just like that, it was decided. Adeline Calder, the cursed widow of Copperline, was going to marry the wealthiest, most feared man in the territory, and disappear into canyon country. She should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in months, she felt something almost like relief. They were married at dawn by a traveling preacher, who asked no questions and cared even less. The ceremony took 10 minutes. She wore the same dress she'd been wearing for weeks, torn and stained despite her best efforts. He wore black. There were no witnesses except the hotel clerk and a dog asleep in the corner. Do you take this man? I do. Do you take this woman? I do. Then by the authority vested in me. Man and wife. A pause. That'll be $5. Cashas paid. They walked out into early morning light. A wagon already loaded. 2 horses tied to the back. Her belongings, a spare shift, her husband's wedding ring, a brush with missing teeth, took up less space than a sack of flour. Ready? Cashas asked. She looked back at Copperline one last time. Still mostly asleep. A few people stirring. None of them paying any attention to the wagon leaving. Why would they? The curse was finally gone. Yes, she said. I'm ready. The land grew rougher as they climbed. Gentle slopes giving way to rocky terrain cut through with dry creek beds. The heat built. She pulled her shawl over her head against the sun. Cashas drove in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Just quiet, like they were both adjusting to a new reality neither had fully agreed to feel, even though they'd both signed for it. She studied him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to decide who this man really was. After hours, they stopped to rest the horses. He handed her a canteen without comment. Water warm but clean. How much further? Another hour to the canyon rim. Then we drop down. Ranch is in the valley below. Do you have workers? 3 permanent hands. Obadiah, he's been with me going on 15 years. Jasper, young fella, good with horses. Man everyone just calls Amos, too stubborn to retire and too mean to die. A pause. Few others come and go with the season. Mostly it's just us. And they won't have a problem with you bringing home a wife? They'll have a problem if I tell them to have a problem. Matter of fact. Not a boast. Obadiah's wife passed 3 years back. He understands loss. Jasper's young enough not to ask stupid questions. And Amos has seen enough of life that nothing surprises him anymore. They rode on. The landscape grew dramatic. Walls of red stone rising on either side, as they followed something that looked more like a goat path than a road. Her hands clenched the wagon seat as they navigated switchbacks, that dropped away into nothing. Then they crested a rise. And there it was. The valley spread below like something out of a painting. A green basin carved between canyon walls. A river glittering through the center. Buildings clustered at one end, too far to make out details but solid. Real. Cattle dotting the grassland. And beyond it all, mountains rising blue and distant. Beautiful. Isolated. The most remote place she'd ever seen. "Welcome home," Cashas said. 3 men were waiting by the house when they pulled up. The oldest was weathered brown, as old leather, watching their approach with eyes like a hawk. A younger one stood with his arms crossed. Solid, careful, unreadable. The third was a young ranch hand, shuffling his feet. Nervous energy he clearly hadn't learned to hide yet. "Obadiah, Amos, Jasper." Cashas climbed down, turned, offered Adeline his hand. "This is my wife, Adeline. She'll be running the household from now on. Anything domestic, you take it to her. Understand?" Obadiah studied her a long moment, then nodded, slow. "Welcome, ma'am." "Thank you," she managed. Amos spat tobacco juice and grunted something that might have been agreement if you squinted at it right. Jasper just stared. "Help us unload," Cashas said. "Then give us some space. Been a long ride." The men moved to obey, and Adeline found herself standing in front of a house that was apparently hers now. Married to a man she barely knew. In a valley, so isolated she couldn't see the way out, from where she stood. Cashas touched her elbow, gentle. "I'll show you around. Then you rest. We'll figure the rest out as we go." The house was clean but sparse. The domain of someone who cared about function over comfort. Main room, fireplace, a table and chairs that had seen better decades. Kitchen off to one side. Stairs leading up. "Your room's upstairs. First door on the right. I'm at the end of the hall." He paused. "There's a lock on your door. Use it if you want. I won't be offended." She set her bag down. "Why did you really do this?" she asked suddenly. The real reason. He was quiet a long time. "Because I watched my wife die alone, while I was useless," he said finally. "Because I've spent 5 years in this house with ghosts. Because I'm tired of being alone with my failures." He met her eyes. "And because when I saw you lying in that dirt, I saw someone who'd understand that sometimes survival is the only victory that matters." It wasn't romantic, but it was true. And truth, Adeline was learning, was worth more than any pretty lie she'd ever been handed. "All right," she said. "Let's figure out how to survive this together." The first week was harder than she expected, and she'd expected hard. The house wasn't dirty, exactly. It had the particular kind of neglect that comes from men living alone too long. Dust in corners. Grease wiped but never scrubbed off the stove. Windows that hadn't been properly washed in years. She threw herself into it like penance. Scrubbing and organizing, from dawn until her hands cramped, and her back screamed for mercy it wasn't going to get. Cashas watched her work, with an expression she couldn't read. On the 3rd day, he finally said something. "You don't have to do all this at once." She was on her knees, scrubbing the kitchen floor. Didn't look up. "It needs doing. It's been like this for months. Another week won't kill anyone. I need to do something." She sat back on her heels, pushed hair out of her face. "I need to feel useful." He studied her, nodded, left her to it. That was something she was learning about him. He didn't push, didn't argue, just observed and adjusted. Unsettling in its own way, like living with someone who was always calculating something, but never showed you the math. The ranch hands kept their distance at first. Obadiah polite but formal. Jasper ducking his head whenever their paths crossed. Amos ignored her existence entirely, like she was a piece of furniture that had appeared in the house and might vanish just as mysteriously as it came. She didn't blame them. She was an outsider, an unknown quantity, someone the boss had brought home after a 2-day courtship, if you could even call it that. They had every right to be careful. On the 5th day, she made biscuits, Not a grand gesture. She just had time before breakfast and flour that needed using. But when she set them on the table, still warm, something shifted. Obadiah bit into one. Eyebrows went up. These are good. My mother's recipe. She teach you to cook? She tried. I was better at other things. Sewing. Mending. But I learned enough. Amos took 3 without comment. Jasper took one, and ate it so fast she wasn't sure he'd tasted it at all. Cashas ate his slowly. Methodically. When he finished, he looked at her. Make those again. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, Obadiah knocked on the kitchen door before dawn. Adeline answered in her nightgown with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, half awake and confused. Sorry to bother you, ma'am. Hat in his hands. But the coffee, the way the boss makes it. He made a face. Terrible. If you know how to make it right, we'd appreciate it. She almost laughed. Almost. I can do that. From then on, she made the coffee every morning. Strong and dark, the way working men needed it. None of the weak brew Mrs. Whitfield had preferred, back at the boarding house, that felt, already, like it belonged to some other version of her life. The hands started showing up to breakfast instead of grabbing food and disappearing. Started talking, trading stories about cattle and fences and the 100 small problems that came with running a ranch this size. She listened more than she spoke. Learned that Obadiah had worked ranches across 3 territories before settling here. That Jasper had come north after some kind of trouble nobody named out loud. That Amos had been a trapper before his knees gave out, and that Cashas had hired him more out of pity than need, though nobody said that part either. And slowly she learned about Cashas himself. He woke before sunrise without fail, checked the horses first, walked the property line looking for breaks in the fence, for signs of predators. Worked alongside his men, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Quiet, mostly, but when he spoke, people listened because he never wasted words on things that didn't matter. He was also deeply, fundamentally alone. She saw it in the way he sat apart at meals, even while sitting at the table with everyone. Saw it in how he'd start to say something, then stop himself, like a man who'd forgotten how to hold a casual conversation. Saw it in the evenings, when he'd stand on the porch smoking and staring at the mountains until full dark, and the expression on his face went so empty it made her own chest ache to look at it. She understood that look. She'd worn it herself. In Copperline, in the cellar, in every mirror she'd avoided since the flood. 2 weeks in, she woke to shouting, grabbed the rifle Cashas had shown her, loaded, safety on, and crept to her door. The hallway was dark. The shouting was coming from his room. She stood outside, heart hammering, trying to decide what to do. The words were incomprehensible. Just raw sound, pain vocalized. Then something crashed. That made up her mind. Cashas. Through the door. Are you all right? Silence. I'm fine. His voice hoarse and wrecked. Not fine at all. Go back to bed. You're not fine. Can I come in? No. I'm coming in anyway. The room was a mess. Chair overturned. Lamp knocked to the floor. Blankets twisted like he'd been fighting them all night and losing. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, breathing hard. She set the rifle down, approached slow, the way you'd approach a wounded animal that might still have some fight left in it. Nightmare? Something like that. You want to talk about it? No. She sat beside him, not touching, just present. They stayed like that a while, the only sound their breathing gradually syncing up without either of them meaning it to. Finally, he lifted his head. I dream about her sometimes. Quiet. About being too slow, too stupid to save her. About watching her die and being useless. A laugh, bitter and broken. 5 years and it doesn't get easier. Just different. My husband drowned, she said. In the flood. I couldn't reach him. Water was too fast and I wasn't strong enough and he just went under. She stopped. Started again. I hear him calling for help sometimes. In my sleep, When I'm awake. All the time. He looked at her. Really looked. And something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The particular understanding that only comes from shared damage. Does it ever stop? He asked. I don't know. I hope so. Yeah. Quiet. Me too. She stood. Righted the chair. Fixed the lamp. You should try to sleep. Morning comes early. Adeline. She turned. He was still sitting there, looking lost in a way she'd never seen on him before. Thank you for not making it a big thing. Everyone's got ghosts, she said. No point making a fuss about it. After that, something changed. Not friendship exactly, but partnership. The kind of bond that comes from watching each other's damage up close and not flinching away from it. They fell into patterns that felt oddly natural. She'd have coffee ready when he came in from morning rounds. He'd make sure the firewood was stocked before she thought to ask. Small gestures, practical ones, but they added up to something that felt almost like belonging. The ranch stopped feeling foreign. She learned the layout, learned which animals were temperamental and which were docile, helped Obadiah treat a sick calf, held it still, while he cleaned an infected wound, mended Jasper's shirts, and pretended not to notice him blushing his thanks. Even got Amos to crack something resembling a smile when she made cornbread the way he'd once mentioned his mother used to. It was almost peaceful, of course. That's exactly when the first threat arrived. She found it during morning rounds. A dead crow, nailed to the fence post nearest the canyon trail. Wings spread wide. Eyes plucked out. Carved into the post beneath it 3 words. Remember your debts. She stared at it a long time, then went to find Cashas. He was in the barn checking tack. She described what she'd found without preamble. Watched his expression go hard and flat. Show me. They walked to the fence in silence. He studied the crow, the message, the way the trail beyond showed recent tracks, then pulled the crow down and threw it into the brush like it had personally offended him. Who did this? Old business. His jaw tight. People I thought had forgotten about me. What kind of business? He was quiet long enough she thought he wouldn't answer. I wasn't always a rancher, he said finally. Used to run with a crew back during the war, the one still going on east of here. We did jobs. Some of it stealing, mostly. Some of it worse. Made good money. Until it went bad. He touched the carved letters. Man who ran the crew, Ezekiel Crow. He thinks I owe him. For the job that went wrong. For the men who died. For not going back to that life when he came asking. How much does he think you owe him? Everything. He looked at her. My ranch. My cattle. My life, probably. Adeline felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Because she had thought, foolishly maybe, that she'd found a quiet corner of the world to disappear into. Except quiet corners, it turned out, had a way of finding their own storms. This is what I meant, Cashas said. About having enemies. About this place being dangerous. If you want to leave. I'm not leaving. The words came out harder than she intended. I've been run out of one place already. I'm not doing it again. Something flickered across his face. Respect, maybe, or concern, or both, tangled together in a way neither of them had a name for yet. All right, he said. Then we prepare. Because Ezekiel Crow, he told her, didn't make threats he didn't intend to keep. And whatever peace they'd found in the last 2 weeks, the coffee, the biscuits, the quiet nights on the porch, was about to be tested by something neither of them could outscrub, outcook, or outwait. Adeline stood at the fence line long, after Cashas walked away, looking at the place where the crow had hung. 3 words carved into old wood, and underneath them, a truth she was only beginning to understand, that the man she'd married for safety came with a past just as dangerous as the town she'd fled, that the ranch she'd hoped might be an ending was, instead, only the beginning of something much larger, and that whatever came next, she was no longer the woman who'd stumbled into Copperline covered in mud and grief. She was someone else now. She just didn't know yet what that someone was going to have to become. The Crow's message hung over Ironwood for 3 days before anything happened. Which was the worst part, honestly, because waiting is its own kind of violence. Waiting lets the mind build the thing it's afraid of, brick by brick, until the imagined version is worse than whatever's actually coming. Adeline learned that fast. She'd catch herself standing at the kitchen window, hands frozen mid-task, staring at the tree line like it might blink first. Then she'd catch herself catching herself. Shake it off. Go back to kneading bread that didn't need kneading anymore. Cashas doubled the watch. Had Obadiah and Jasper walk the fence line twice a day instead of once. Cleaned every gun in the house, until the smell of oil sat in the air like a warning of its own. "You're not sleeping," she said one evening, setting a plate in front of him he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. "Neither are you." "That's not an answer." "Wasn't meant to be one." "Fair enough." On the third night, the answer came riding down the canyon trail at sunset, and it came with 6 men behind it. Adeline saw the dust first. A smudge on the horizon that didn't belong there. Then Jasper, sprinting from the north pasture, breath tearing out of him in ragged bursts. Riders, 6 of them, coming fast. She dropped what she was holding, because there's a sound a body makes when fear takes over the muscles before the mind has caught up. A kind of static, and she felt it now, crawling up from her stomach, into her throat, except there wasn't time to feel it properly. There was only time to move. Cashas was already on the porch, rifle in hand, watching the dust cloud, with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Flat, emptied out, like a man clearing space inside himself for whatever was about to need it. "Could be anyone," Obadiah said. Didn't sound like he believed it. "It's them." Cashas didn't blink. The riders came down slow, unhurried, which was somehow worse than if they'd charged, because unhurried meant confident, and confident meant they thought they'd already won something before the first word was spoken. The man in front was lean, a scar running from temple to jaw like something had once tried to split his face in half and hadn't quite finished the job. Even at this distance, Adeline could see the particular cruelty in the set of his mouth, the kind that enjoys itself. Ezekiel Crow. He stopped 30 feet from the house, smiled, all teeth, no warmth behind any of it. Cashas Reeve. His voice carried easy across the yard. "Been a long time. Not long enough. That's no way to greet an old friend." "We were never friends." Cashas's rifle stayed low, steady. "You were the man who got 7 men killed and called it leadership." Crow's smile didn't move. "That's your version." "It's the truth. My version is you ran, like a coward, while good men died covering your retreat." And there it was, the lie Adeline had heard whispered before, not the details, but the shape of it, the accusation that Cashas had abandoned his own crew. She watched his jaw tighten, watched him hold it in, which told her more than the words themselves did, because a guilty man argues loud. A man who's been carrying an unfair story around for years just goes quiet and lets his hands do the shaking instead of his mouth. "You know that's not what happened, do I? You were the one who wanted to hit that supply train." Cashas's voice dropped, low and hard. "Wounded men on it, bandages, medicine, and I said no. Said there was a line even for men like us. You didn't like that answer." Crow's grin flickered, just for a second, long enough that Adeline caught it, because that flicker was the truth showing through the crack, wasn't it? That flicker meant Cashas wasn't the coward in this story. He was the one man in a rotten crew who'd refused to rob dying soldiers of their medicine, and the crew got caught anyway, and somehow the story had been rewritten, so he was the villain of it. "You always did have a taste for speeches," Crow said. "Doesn't change what you owe me. I don't owe you anything." "I think you do." Crow's eyes drifted, slow, deliberate, toward the upstairs window, where Adeline stood, rifle in her own hands now, watching. "I heard you got yourself a new wife. Widow, wasn't she? From Copperline?" A pause, savoring it. "Must be special." if you finally crawled out of mourning for her. Adeline's grip tightened on the rifle. She had him lined up. One shot. But Cashas had told her, wait, don't fire first. Not unless there's no choice left. You go near her, Cashas said, quiet as a held breath. I'll kill you. That's not a threat. That's a fact. You'll shoot me in front of witnesses? We both know you're smarter than that. Crow turned his horse. Slow, making a show of not being afraid. I'll be seeing you, Cashas, real soon. And next time, I won't be so friendly. They rode out unhurried, the same way they'd come. Adeline kept the rifle on Crow's back until the dust swallowed them whole. Then she set it down, hands shaking, went downstairs to a house that suddenly felt too big and too small at the same time. That night, Cashas told her the rest of it. Not because she demanded it, because he seemed finally tired of carrying it alone. His name's Ezekiel Crow. We rode together during the war. Not soldiers. A short, humorless laugh. Opportunists. Took what the chaos left unguarded. He stared into the fire like it owed him something. There was a supply train, meant for a field hospital 2 counties over. Crow wanted to hit it. I said no. Why? Because there's a difference between stealing from men who can afford the loss and stealing bandages off dying soldiers. His voice went flinty. I walked, told him I was out. 3 days later, the whole crew got ambushed by a marshal's posse. 7 men, dead or hanged. A pause. Crow got away clean. Somehow I became the coward in the story he tells. The one who ran while good men bled. That's not what happened. Doesn't matter what happened. Matters what people believe. You should understand that better than anyone, Mrs. Reeve. Which landed harder than he probably meant it to. Because he was right. Because she'd learned that lesson in the dirt of Copperline's Main Street. Hadn't she? That truth and belief are 2 entirely different animals, and belief almost always wins the fight. So he wants revenge, she said. He wants this ranch, wants my cattle, my land. A pause. And I think underneath all that talk of debts and dead men, I think he wants to prove he was right about me all along. That I'm just as rotten as he is. He can't stand that I got out and built something, and he didn't. What do? We prepare. He looked at her, firelight carving hard shadows into his face. Because Crow doesn't make threats he doesn't follow through on. And next time he won't ride away so easy. Preparing meant teaching her to shoot properly, not just point and hope. They went out every afternoon to a clearing beyond the barn. Cashas setting up bottles and cans while Adeline tried to get her body to stop flinching every time the trigger gave way under her finger. Don't think about it like killing, he said, adjusting her grip for the 3rd time. Think about it like surviving. You're not a killer, Adeline, but you need to be willing to be one if it comes down to you or them. I don't know if I can. You can. You just haven't needed to yet. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. Hard. Shot went wide. Again. Again. By the end of the session, her shoulder was bruised purple, and only half her shots landed anywhere near the target. But Cashas nodded like, that was exactly the progress he'd expected. Better. I'm terrible. You're getting better than terrible. That's called progress. Which, fine. She'd take it. Because somewhere in the repetition, in the bang and the kick and the reload, something in her that had spent months curling smaller and smaller started very slowly to uncurl. Felt strange. Felt necessary. Felt most days like putting on a coat that didn't fit, yet but might eventually, if she wore it long enough. Then came the note. Not carved into wood this time. Folded and left under a rock by the front gate, where anyone riding up would have to see it first. Cashas unfolded it in the kitchen. Read it twice. Handed it to her without a word. 3 lines in a hand that slanted hard to the left like whoever wrote it was in a hurry to be finished. You took something from me once. I intend to take more than a ranch back. E.C. He's not just talking about property, Adeline said slowly. No. He's talking about... She stopped herself. Because saying it out loud made it heavier somehow. made it real in a way that thinking it hadn't. Me, Cashas said, flat. Or you, whichever hurts more. 2 days later, Tobias Renner showed up at the edge of Ironwood's land, which made no sense, because Renner belonged to Copperline, belonged to the saloon and the dusty street and the particular brand of small cruelty that thrives in towns too poor and too bored to have better things to do with their meanness. He had no business 3 hours out, riding a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard and paid for in cash that didn't come from honest work. Jasper spotted him first, called out a warning. By the time Cashas and Adeline reached the gate, Renner was already dismounting. Hands up, half smiling in, that way drunk men smile, when they think charm might save them from a beating they've earned twice over. Didn't come for trouble, he said. Then why'd you come? Cashas said. Not a question. A demand wearing a question's clothes. Renner's eyes flicked to Adeline. Something uneasy passed over his face. Guilt, maybe, if a man like Renner had room left inside him for guilt. I need to talk to your wife. You don't get to talk to her. It's important. Adeline stepped forward before Cashas could argue further, because she'd spent enough of her life being talked over, being decided for, and something in her had run out of patience for it, even from a man trying to protect her. Say it, she said. Renner shifted his weight, looked at the ground. Man paid me, back in Copperline, to rough you up, make it look like the town turning on you natural. Wasn't natural. He paid me good money. Who? Fella with a scar. Never gave a name straight out, but I heard the men with him call him Crow. The world went very quiet for a second, because every bruise, every kick in the dirt, every night she'd lain awake in that cellar wondering what she'd done to deserve a whole town's cruelty, none of it had been natural at all. It had been bought, manufactured, a story someone paid to have written about her, the same way Crow had spent years writing a story about Cashas being a coward. Why tell us now? Cashas said. Voice dangerously quiet. Because he stopped paying. Renner's jaw worked. And because it sat wrong with me, even for a man like me, watching her get kicked in the dirt for money I already spent on whiskey. A pause. Figured I owed her that much. The truth. Adeline looked at him a long moment. Because rage was the easy feeling, the one that wanted to reach for a gun and finish what the boot had started months ago. But underneath the rage, something else moved too, the strange, complicated relief of finally understanding that none of it had been her fault. Not the curse, not the bad luck, not one single bruise. It had all been a weapon aimed somewhere else entirely. Cashas, through her. Get off this land, Cashas said. And if I ever hear you've touched her again. Won't happen, Renner said, already backing toward his horse. I'm done with him, done with all of it. He rode off without looking back, and Adeline stood there in the settling dust, feeling the ground shift under a story she'd believed about herself for months. That night she couldn't sleep, went downstairs, found Cashas at the table, coffee gone cold in front of him, staring at nothing the way he did on the bad nights. You heard all that, she said. I heard. He used me to get to you. Yes, I hate that. Her voice cracked slightly on the word hate, because it wasn't quite big enough for what she was feeling, but it was the closest word she had. I hate that months of my life, the fear, the bruises, all of it, was just a message he was sending you. Like I wasn't even a person in it. Just paper he wrote his threat on. Cashas was quiet a moment. I'm sorry, he said finally. This followed you here because of me. Don't. She sat across from him. Don't apologize for something you didn't do. I brought this into your life. No. Firm. Crow brought this into both our lives. There's a difference. And I'm done. She stopped. Started again, steadier. I'm done being something bad happens to. I want to be someone who does something back. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe. Then we get ready, he said. Because he's not done. Whatever comes next, it's going to be worse than a man in a bar. The attack came 11 days later. No warning this time. No note under a rock. Just the smell of smoke pulling Adeline out of a thin, uneasy sleep at 2 in the morning, and the sound, underneath everything, of horses that didn't belong to Ironwood, moving fast across ground that wasn't theirs to move across. She was on her feet before her mind fully caught up with her body. Rifle, boots half-laced, down the hall where Cashas was already coming out of his own room, already loaded, already moving like a man who'd been half expecting this exact moment for 11 straight days and nights. Barn, he said. One word. All that was needed. They ran. Outside, the world had gone to chaos. Flame climbing the east wall of the barn, orange light throwing long moving shadows across the yard, horses screaming inside, a sound Adeline would carry, with her the rest of her life, the particular animal terror of something trapped and burning. Men on horseback circling the property, firing into the dark more to spread panic than to hit anything specific. Obadiah and Jasper were already returning fire from the corral fence. Get the animals out, Cashas shouted at them. I'll cover you. Adeline flattened herself against the well housing, rifle up, heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. A rider swung past close enough that she could smell the horse sweat, close enough to see the gun in his hand swinging toward Jasper's back. She didn't think. She fired. The rider jerked sideways, fell, didn't get up. The world didn't stop to acknowledge it. There wasn't time for the world to stop. There was only the next breath and the next decision and the terrible clarity of understanding all at once that she had just taken a life, and there would be time to feel that later, except later kept getting pushed back by whatever was happening right now. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about violence. It doesn't pause to let you catch up emotionally. It just keeps happening, 1 second stacked on the next, until eventually it stops, and only then does the weight of it come crashing down all at once, usually at the worst possible time, usually when you're finally alone with it. Another rider bore down on Cashas from behind. Adeline screamed his name, no time for anything more elegant, and fired again. Missed. Fired once more. The rider's horse reared, spooked, threw him hard, into the dirt. Obadiah finished it. The attackers, seeing the numbers no longer favor them, seeing 2 of their own down, wheeled and retreated, into the dark the same way they'd come, leaving the barn to burn, and the smoke to climb into a sky that hadn't asked for any of this. They lost the barn. They lost 2 horses inside it, before Jasper managed to get the rest out, half blind from smoke, coughing so hard he could barely stand upright by the time it was over. Nobody on their side died, which felt, in the gray light, before dawn, like the only mercy the night had bothered to hand out. Adeline sat on the porch steps, as the sun came up, rifle across her knees, staring at the smoking ruin of the barn like it might explain something to her, if she looked at it long enough. Cashas sat down beside her. Didn't say anything at first. Just sat. I shot a man, she said finally, voice strange in her own ears. I saw him fall, and I didn't feel anything. Not right then. That's shock. It'll come later. What if it doesn't? She turned to look at him. What if I'm just cold? What if that's what's left of me now? He was quiet a moment, considering the question with the same care he gave everything. You're not cold, he said finally. You're a person who did what needed doing to keep the people you care about breathing. That's not the same thing as being cruel. Took me a long time to understand the difference myself. Did you? Some nights I still don't. Honest. Unflinching. But I know this, the day it stops mattering to you, the day you don't feel anything at all about taking a life, that's the day to worry. You feeling shaken right now. That's not weakness, Adeline. That's proof you're still exactly who you were before tonight. She wanted to believe him, wanted it badly enough that some small, tired part of her decided, right there on the porch steps, with smoke still hanging in the air, to simply let herself believe it. Because the alternative, carrying this alone, deciding on her own what it meant about her, felt like more weight than she had left to spend. Thank you, she said. For what? For not treating me like I broke something. When really, I think something in me just got stronger. And I don't know what to do with that yet. He reached over, took her hand, didn't say anything more, didn't need to. They rebuilt what they could over the following days. Jasper and Obadiah working the frame of a smaller, temporary shelter for the surviving stock, while Amos muttered the whole time about how nobody ever listened, when he said Crow's kind always circled back twice. It was during the cleanup that they found it. A ledger, half-burned, tucked in the ash near, where the old feed room had stood, pages curling black at the edges, but the ink, somehow mostly legible where the fire hadn't reached. Not Cashas's ledger, someone else's. Adeline found it, actually, on her knees sifting through debris looking for anything salvageable, and the moment she opened the cover and saw the handwriting, her stomach dropped clean through the floor. Because she recognized it. She'd seen that same slanted hand on supply orders, on the note tucked under the rock at the front gate that she'd assumed, at the time, belonged only to Crow. But this ledger had dates, names, small transactions that meant nothing on their own, a payment here, a delivery there, except that late end to end they told a story. Someone at Ironwood had been talking to Crow. For months. Cashas. Her voice came out thinner than she meant it to. You need to see this. He read it standing in the ash, jaw tightening with every line. This is a payment log, he said slowly. Someone's been feeding Crow information. Cattle counts. Watch schedules. He looked up at her, and something cold had settled behind his eyes. Someone here, which meant one of the very small handful of people Adeline had learned to trust, with her life over the last 2 months had been quietly selling, that trust to the man who just burned their barn to the ground. Who? She said. Who would? I don't know. Obadiah's been with you 15 years. I know. Jasper's practically a boy. I know that too. His voice was tight, controlled in the particular way of a man forcing himself not to feel something too large to handle yet. We don't accuse anyone until we're sure. An accusation like that, wrong, could tear this place apart faster than Crow's men ever could. Adeline nodded. But that night, lying awake in a house that suddenly felt less safe than it had the day before, she found herself running through faces. Obadiah's steady, weathered kindness. Jasper's nervous eagerness to please. Even Amos, gruff and distant, who'd never once given her a reason to doubt him beyond his general distrust of most living things. Which one? And underneath that question, a colder one still. Because if trust could be bought this easily, out here in a place she'd started, foolishly maybe, to call home, then what exactly was she building her safety on? What exactly had she married into? She didn't sleep much that night. It was 3 days after the ledger that Cordelia Calloway arrived. Adeline was in the garden, salvaging what the smoke hadn't ruined, when she heard the horse. Single rider, moving fast, in the particular desperate way of someone who'd been riding a good, while on very little confidence that they'd make it. She reached for the rifle she now kept, within arm's reach at all times, the way she reached for breath. Habit now worn into her the way fear used to be. But when the rider crested the rise, it was a woman. Young, maybe 20, slumped in the saddle, barely upright, and as she came closer Adeline could see the bruising across her face, the way she held her ribs like they might be cracked. The woman made it as far as the gate before sliding off the horse entirely, collapsing into the dirt in a heap that Adeline recognized immediately, viscerally, because she'd been, that exact heap herself not, so long ago on a street in Copperline. She was there in seconds, kneeling, checking for injuries with hands that moved faster than her thinking did. Help, the woman whispered, cracked lips, eyes barely focusing. Please, he'll come after me. Who will? My husband. A sob that clearly hurt her ribs to let out. Said I shamed him. Said he'd teach me different. Pause, ragged. Someone in Copperline told me, said there was a woman out here. Said you understood. Adeline's chest tightened. Because of course they'd said that. Because her own story, cursed widow turned rancher's wife, had apparently traveled further than she'd realized, twisting into something else along the way. Not a scandal anymore, a rumor of shelter. "What's your name?" Adeline asked gently. "Cordelia. Cordelia Calloway." "I'm Adeline." She helped her up, slow, careful of the ribs. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you on this land." "You don't know him." "I know men like him." Flat. Certain. "And I know this, whatever he thinks he's owed, he's not getting it here." They carried Cordelia inside. Obadiah fetched water and clean cloth. Adeline worked in silence, cleaning wounds with hands that had gotten steadier over the last few months than she'd ever expected them to be, remembering with a strange, aching clarity what it felt like to be on the receiving end of this exact kindness. Cashas's hand, offered in the dirt of a street she never wanted to see again. "What's your name?" she'd asked, gentle, once Cordelia's breathing had eased. "Cordelia Calloway." "And how old are you, Cordelia?" 20. Grown. A woman making her own choices, however desperate the circumstances that had forced her into making them. Adeline felt something settle at that, some quiet relief that whatever she was building here, it wasn't going to ask her to take responsibility for anyone who hadn't already lived enough life to know what she was running from. "You're staying," Adeline said. Not a question. Cashas, standing in the doorway, said nothing, just nodded once. "This is the second person you've taken in," he said later, once Cordelia was resting. "Second. Yourself. You took yourself in back in Copperline when nobody else would have you." He almost smiled. "Now you're doing it for someone else." "I'm just helping someone who needs it." "No." He shook his head slowly. "You're making a choice about what kind of place this is, what it stands for." A pause. "I'm with you, whatever comes of it." Adeline felt something warm move through her chest. Not romantic exactly, or not only that, something deeper. The particular relief of not being alone in a decision that could very easily put more targets on their backs than they already carried. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." A faint, grim humor in his voice. "Her husband might come looking." "Good." Adeline's voice went flat and hard in a way that surprised even her. "I have some things I'd like to say to a man who does that to his wife." Cordelia woke the next morning stiff and sore but clear-eyed. Adeline sat with her while she ate, not pushing conversation, just present. Finally Cordelia set down her spoon. "Why are you helping me?" "Because someone should have helped me, and didn't." Adeline's voice was steady. "Because I know what it is to have nowhere to go." "What do you want?" Adeline asked. "If you could have anything at all, what would it be?" Cordelia looked at her like the question was foreign, like nobody had asked her that in longer than she could remember. "I want to not be scared all the time," she said finally. "I want to learn things, do things, be something more than just someone's property to hit when he's had a bad day." She wiped her eyes, fierce about it, like she was angry at her own tears for showing up uninvited. "Is that stupid?" "That's human." Adeline took her hand. "You can stay here as long as you need. We'll teach you the ranch. You'll earn your keep, but nobody will hurt you. That's the arrangement." "What if I'm not strong enough?" "Then you'll get stronger. That's what this place seems to do to people." She meant it too, felt the truth of it settle into her own bones even, as she said it out loud for the first time. Over the following weeks, Cordelia slowly came back to herself. The flinching eased. She learned to work alongside Jasper, feeding stock and mending fence. Obadiah taught her basic carpentry, patient in a way that surprised everyone including himself. And Adeline taught her to shoot in the same clearing where she herself had first learned, watching a version of her own fear play out in someone else's hands, and finding strangely that helping someone else, through it helped her carry her own a little easier too. It was going through Cordelia's few belongings, helping her sort what little she'd managed to grab before fleeing, that another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Folded into the lining of an old coat, a letter, not addressed to Cordelia, addressed to her husband apparently and never sent or sent and returned, the paper worn soft from handling. Adeline almost didn't read it, except something about the handwriting caught her eye. The same hard, left-leaning slant she'd seen twice now, once under a rock at the front gate, once in a half-burned ledger pulled from the ashes of her own barn. She read it twice before she understood what she was looking at, because it wasn't a letter about revenge at all. It was a letter about Silver, written months before Crow ever rode down that canyon trail, before the Crow nailed to the fence post, before any of it, a letter to an old associate mentioning, almost in passing, a survey done years back, before the war, before Cashas ever bought the land, a vein running under a certain stretch of canyon country that everyone at the time had assumed was worthless scrub. Ironwood sat directly on top of it. Adeline sat very still for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. Because if this was true, if this was the real reason Crow wanted the ranch so badly, wanted it back with a hunger that seemed disproportionate even to old grudges and dead men, then everything he'd said about debts, about honor, about 7 men who died covering a coward's retreat, all of it was theater. A story, dressed up as revenge, covering something much simpler and much older. Greed. She found Cashas in the yard, showed him the letter, with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking. He read it, read it again. His face went through something complicated, anger first, and then something almost like relief, the particular relief of finally understanding an enemy well enough to stop being afraid of the parts you don't understand. He never cared about honor, Cashas said slowly. Never cared about the men who died. This whole time he's been circling a fortune he thinks belongs to him, and dressing it up as justice because justice sounds better than greed, when you're trying to convince men to ride with you and burn another man's barn down. Does that change anything? No. His jaw set hard. But it means we're not fighting a man who thinks he's owed something. We're fighting a man who wants what's under our feet, and doesn't care who burns to get it. The days that followed carried a different weight, because now they weren't only watching for Crow's riders. They were watching each other too, quietly, carefully, trying to work out which of the small handful of people at Ironwood had been trading information for money, feeding Crow the movements of a household that had, slowly, painfully, started to feel like family. It ate at Adeline more than she expected, because trust, once she'd started letting herself feel it again, turned out to be a fragile thing. Easy to build brick by brick, over weeks of shared coffee and mended shirts. Terrifyingly easy to knock down with one half-burned ledger and a handwriting sample that could belong to any one of a dozen men who passed through Ironwood on any given week. She found herself watching Jasper a little too closely one evening, caught herself doing it, hated herself for it, a little because the boy had done nothing but earn her trust since the day she arrived, and here she was, measuring him against a shadow of doubt he hadn't asked for. Except, she noticed things too, small things, the way he'd started avoiding her eyes at supper the last few nights. The way he'd been seen, Obadiah mentioned it offhand, not thinking much of it, riding out toward the Eastern Trail alone, twice without explanation, when the Eastern Trail led nowhere Ironwood business required him to go. She said nothing to Cashas yet, because an accusation, wrong, could tear this place apart faster than Crow's men ever could. His words, and she believed them, even as suspicion sat heavy and cold in her stomach every time Jasper passed her in the yard, with that same averted gaze. The truth came out 3 nights later, and not from Jasper at all. It was Amos, gruff, silent Amos, who'd spoken maybe 40 words to Adeline in 2 months, who came to the house late one night, hat in hand, looking like a man carrying something he badly wanted to set down. "Ma'am." Rough voice. "Boss around?" Cashas came to the door. "There's a man," Amos said. "Comes through sometimes, trading horses. Name of Whitcomb. Owed the boss money once, years back, before I ever signed on here. Boss forgave the debt. Whitcomb never forgot it, in a bad way. Been seeing him ride through more than usual these last months. Didn't think nothing of it till the barn burned." "You think he's the one talking to Crow?" "I think," Amos said, slow and careful, "that a man forgiven a debt sometimes hates the person who forgave him more than he'd ever hate the person who collected it. Shame does strange things to a man's gratitude. Took 2 more days to confirm it. 2 days of quiet watching, of Obadiah tracking Whitcomb's movements without ever letting on that anyone suspected until they caught him plain, a folded note in his saddlebag addressed to nobody, in a hand that matched the ledger exactly, detailing the ranch's reduced watch rotation after the fire. He didn't deny it once caught, just stood there, in the yard, looking somewhere between ashamed and defiant. "You forgave the debt," he said to Cashas, almost accusing. "Man like you doesn't forgive a debt without wanting something bigger back eventually. I figured I was working it off either way I looked at it." "I never wanted anything back," Cashas said, quiet and cold. "That was the whole point of forgiving it." Whitcomb had nothing to say to that. They didn't simply send him off this time. Cashas had Obadiah bind his hands and hold him in the tack room overnight, and at first light Jasper rode for the territorial marshal's outpost 2 counties over, carrying the note and the ledger both as proof. By the time the marshal's deputy arrived to collect him 3 days later, Whitcomb had already given a full accounting of what he'd traded, and when, hoping the cooperation might count for something later, it would eventually, but not yet, Adeline stood beside Cashas watching him ride away under guard, feeling the strange mixture of relief and grief that comes from learning the worst thing you feared turned out to be true, just not aimed at the person you'd been quietly dreading it might be. "I thought it was Jasper," she admitted later. "So did I for a day or two. That's an awful thing, suspecting someone who's done nothing but earn it." "It is," Cashas nodded slowly, "but better an awful thought kept quiet than an accusation spoken too soon. You held it. That matters." She wasn't sure it mattered enough to undo the guilt of it. But she let herself believe at least a little that restraint counted for something. With the mole gone, Crow's advantage thinned, but it didn't disappear, because a week later, riding back from checking a stretch of fence, with Cashas, Adeline spotted smoke on the far ridge. Not their land, not their fire. A signal, maybe, or a camp, tucked just close enough to Ironwood's border to feel like a held breath before the next strike. "He's regrouping," Cashas said, watching it. "Whitcomb's gone quiet, but Crow still knows this land better than most men alive. He'll find another way in." "Then we don't wait for him to find it." He looked at her, something new in his expression. Not quite surprise. More like recognizing a decision arriving fully formed in someone who, months ago, would have waited to be told what to think. "You've changed," he said. "So have you." "How do you mean?" "You used to talk like you were the only one carrying this fight." She met his eyes, steady. "You don't talk like that anymore." He didn't answer right away, but that night on the porch, in the particular quiet that had become theirs over the last 2 months, he reached over and took her hand without a word of explanation needed. And Adeline Reeve, she reminded herself, still getting used to the shape of the name in her own mind, let herself lean into it, just slightly, just enough to feel, for one unguarded moment, that whatever came next, they'd be the ones deciding how it ended. Not Crow, because out here nothing worth having ever came easy. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in a camp lit by a fire that wasn't theirs, Ezekiel Crow was doing the same math she was, counting what he had left, deciding what he was willing to burn to get the rest. The smoke on the ridge didn't move for 2 days, which meant Crow was waiting, and waiting, Adeline had learned by now, was Crow's favorite weapon. Worse than fire, worse than a rifle, because fire burns fast and a rifle finishes something in a second, but waiting gets inside a house and sits at the table with you. Waiting eats breakfast across from you every morning and doesn't say a word. She caught herself checking the tree line so often that Obadiah finally said something. "Ma'am, you'll wear a groove in that window frame, you keep leaning on it like that." "Can't help it." "I know." He didn't smile exactly, but something close. "None of us can." Cashas had gone quiet in a different way than before. Not the grief quiet of those first weeks, the kind that came from staring at mountains and thinking about a wife who never got to grow old with him. This was a working quiet, a man doing arithmetic in his head, counting rifles, counting hands, counting how many of each he had against how many Crow might bring next time, because there was no version of this where Crow simply gave up and rode away for good. Men like that didn't ride away. They circled. The third night, Cashas found her in the kitchen long, after the house had gone dark, sitting at the table with a lamp turned low and Whitcomb's confession, what little of it she'd bothered to write down, spread out in front of her like she could make it mean something new if she stared hard enough. "Can't sleep," he said. "Not a question. Keep thinking about the silver." "What about it? About how none of this—" She gestured vague at the dark window, the burned outline of the barn just visible against the moonlight. "None of it was ever really about you, or Whitcomb's shame, or even me." She looked up at him. "It's about what's under our feet. Everything else is just the story he tells, so it sounds like something other than greed." "Does that make it easier?" "No. Honest. Harder, maybe, because a man who wants revenge, you can sometimes talk him down. Show him the truth, shame him into stopping." A pause. "A man who wants what's underground doesn't care about truth at all. He just wants us gone so he can start digging." Cashas sat across from her, rested his hands flat on the table, like he needed something solid to hold onto while he said the next part. "I've been thinking," he said, "about going to him first, instead of waiting." "No. Adeline. No. Firmer. That's exactly what he wants. You alone on his ground where he decides how it ends." She shook her head, hard. "We already tried waiting for him to come to us. Now you want to hand him the other half of what he's after on a plate?" "I want this over." "So do I." Her voice cracked, just slightly on the word I. "But not like that. Not you alone, dead in some canyon, while the rest of us find out, from a horse that comes back without a rider." Something in his face gave just a fraction. "Then what?" he said. "Tell me your plan if mine's no good." And that was new. Him asking, not deciding first and informing her after, the way he had in those early weeks, back when this had still felt like his fight, and she was only along for the shelter of it. "We don't go to him," she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "We make him come to us, on our ground, where we know every inch of it and he doesn't. He tried that already, burned the barn doing it. He tried it once, with the advantage of a spy telling him our schedule." She met his eyes. "He doesn't have that anymore, and he doesn't know we know about the silver, which means, far as he's concerned, we still think this is only about old debts and dead men. You want to use what he doesn't know. I want to use everything he doesn't know." Cashas studied her a long moment, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen aimed at her before. Not affection exactly, though that had been building steadily for weeks now in its own quiet way. Something closer to respect. The particular respect one survivor gives another, when they finally recognize the same hardness in someone else that they've spent years building in themselves. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." They spent the next 4 days preparing in a way that felt different from the frantic scramble after the barn fire. Slower, more deliberate. Cashas rode out to speak with 2 ranchers on neighboring spreads, men who'd never had much use for him personally, given his reputation, but who had even less use for a man like Crow burning barns and threatening wives across the territory. "Why would they help you?" Adeline asked, the night before he rode out. "You said yourself most of them think you're just as dangerous as Crow." "Because dangerous and predictable is one thing." He checked the cinch on his saddle, not looking at her. "Crow's dangerous and hungry for something under the ground that doesn't belong to him. That scares men worse than my reputation ever did. A man who wants your cattle you can negotiate with. A man who wants what's buried under your whole spread, there's no negotiating that." He was right, as it turned out. 2 days later, 4 more riders showed up at Ironwood's gate. Not Crow's men, neighbors, men Adeline had never met, who eyed her with the particular wary curiosity of people who'd heard stories about the cursed widow-turned-rancher's wife and weren't entirely sure which version to believe. "Heard what happened to your barn," one of them said, older, weathered, introducing himself only as Garrity. "Heard, too, what he tried to pull on your wife back in Copperline." paying a man to beat on her, so it'd look like the town's own doing. He spat, disgusted. Man who'd stoop to that. I don't much care what old grudge he's carrying. I care that he's the kind who'll do that to get what he wants. Adeline felt something loosen in her chest, hearing it said plain like that, because for months the story of what happened to her in Copperline had lived in her chest, as private shame, something she carried alone, something that made her different, marked, cursed. And here was a stranger naming it out loud as exactly what it was. Cruelty. Bought and paid for. Nothing about her at all. Thank you, she said, quiet, meant more than the words managed to carry. Garrity just nodded, awkward with it the way men of that country often were with anything that came too close to feeling. The trap, when they finally built it, was simple in the way the best plans usually are. They let it be known, carefully, through channels that would reach Crow's ears without seeming deliberate, that Cashas was riding out alone to the north pasture on a specific morning, to check a stretch of fence line that happened to run close along the canyon trail. Isolated. Perfect ground on the surface for an ambush. Except it wasn't Cashas who rode out alone. It was Obadiah, wearing Cashas's coat and hat at a distance, riding Cashas's horse, moving with the same unhurried confidence Crow would expect to see, and hidden along the ridge above, in positions scouted 2 days prior, and rehearsed until everyone's part in it sat cold, and certain in their chest, waited the rest of them. Cashas, Jasper, Amos, Garrity and his 3 riders. And Adeline, rifle steady in her hands, positioned exactly where Cashas had insisted she be, high ground, clear sight line, out of the worst of whatever was about to happen below. She hated the waiting, hated it the way she'd learned to hate every kind of waiting, since the flood first took her husband, and left her standing on a riverbank with nothing to do but watch water that had already stopped listening to her. Except this waiting was different, wasn't it? Because this time she wasn't waiting for something to happen to her. She was waiting to happen to it. Crow's men came down the canyon trail just past mid-morning. 8 riders this time, not 6. He'd rebuilt his numbers since the barn. Adeline watched through the rifle sight as they slowed, spread out, closing in on the decoy rider, with the particular confident sloppiness of men who believed they'd already won. Crow himself rode at the center, Scar catching the morning light, that same terrible, satisfied smile on his face, the one Adeline had first seen across 30 feet of dirt in front of Ironwood's house, promising he'd be seeing them soon. He was closer now than he'd ever been. Reeve. Crow's voice carried up the canyon, sure of itself. Told you I'd be back. Obadiah, still wearing the coat, hat pulled low, playing the part exactly, as they'd rehearsed, said nothing. Just kept his rifle loose across the saddle, waiting for the signal. Nothing to say? Crow's smile widened. Fine by me. Makes this easier. He raised his hand, which was the signal, as it turned out, but not the one Crow's men were expecting. Because the moment his hand went up, gunfire opened from the ridge on both sides, not at the decoy, but at Crow's flanks, catching his riders in a crossfire they hadn't scouted, hadn't expected, because as far as Crow knew, this ranch was down to 3 exhausted men, and a widow who could barely hold a rifle steady 8 months ago. Chaos. Horses screaming, wheeling, men diving for what cover the open ground offered, which wasn't much. Adeline fired, steady, this time, none of the wild shaking from the barn fire, because something in her had settled, into this the way water settles, into the shape of whatever holds it, and watched a rider go down, without letting herself feel the weight of it yet. Later. There would be time to feel it later. Right now there was only the next breath. The next shot. The next decision made faster than thought, the way Cashas had promised her it would come, if the moment ever demanded it. Crow, seeing his ambush turned inside out, seeing 2 of his men already down, and 3 more scrambling for the tree line, did the only thing a man like him knew how to do when a plan collapsed. He ran for the decoy rider, grabbed for Obadiah, still mounted, still playing his part, meaning clearly to drag a hostage out of the chaos, and buy himself passage through it. Obadiah, 15 years with Cashas, 15 years of loyalty, that had never once wavered even under the weight of a false accusation nobody had spoken aloud, but everyone had briefly carried, was not a man who let himself be taken easily. He drove his elbow back into Crow's face. Hard. Crow reeled, fell from his own saddle, dragging Obadiah half off his horse with him. They hit the ground together, grappling, and for one long, terrible moment Adeline lost sight of them both in the churned dust of the fight. She was already moving before she'd decided to move. Down the ridge, half sliding on loose scree, rifle in one hand, because Obadiah had shown her kindness from the very first week, the coffee, the biscuits, the quiet welcome, that had meant more than he probably ever realized, and she was not going to stand on high ground and watch him die in the dirt, because the plan said her job was to stay put. Cashas reached them first. She saw it happen in fragments, the way memory sometimes breaks a single terrible minute into pieces too sharp to hold all at once. Cashas pulling Crow off Obadiah by the collar. Crow, blood streaming from his nose, twisting free with a knife suddenly in his hand, the blade catching the light exactly the way his smile always had, bright and cruel and certain of itself. Cashas, her own voice torn out of her, before she'd decided to use it. Crow lunged. Cashas caught his wrist. Barely. The blade stopped inches from his ribs, the two of them locked together, straining years of old grievance and buried greed compressed down into one shaking contest of strength that could not, physically, last much longer. Adeline reached them with her rifle raised. But there was no clean shot. Not with the two men tangled together like that. Crow's body angled, so close to Cashas's, that a bullet meant for one could just as easily find the other. So she did the only other thing she could think to do. She swung the rifle stock, hard, into the back of Crow's skull. He staggered. Grip loosening just enough. Cashas wrenched the knife free and threw it aside, and then it was 2 against 1, Cashas pinning Crow's arms, while Adeline pressed her boot down hard on his wrist to keep him from reaching for anything else hidden in his coat. "Enough," Cashas said, breathing hard. "It's over, Ezekiel." Crow, pinned in the dirt, blood on his face, laughed. An ugly, broken sound. "You gonna kill me now, Reeve? Finish it proper? Prove I was right about you all along?" Cashas looked down at him, and Adeline, watching his face, saw the exact moment he chose. Saw the years of guilt, the years of being called a coward for refusing to rob dying men of their bandages, weigh against the easy, satisfying finality of a bullet. "No," Cashas said finally. "Why not?" "Because that's what you do." His voice was steady, certain. "And I already proved years ago, I'm not you. Not gonna stop proving it now, just because you finally gave me a good enough reason to want to." Around them, the fighting had already burned itself out. Garrity's men had rounded up 2 of Crow's remaining riders, hands bound, faces sullen with the particular defeat of men who'd signed on for easy money and gotten a war instead. The rest had scattered into the canyon, and nobody much cared to chase them. It was over, just like that, faster than the waiting that had come before it. Violence always was. They took Crow back to Ironwood bound and silent, and from there, 2 days later, handed him, along with the half-burned ledger, Whitcomb's confession, and Garrity willing to stand, as a witness to everything he'd seen, over to the territorial marshal, who rode a wide circuit through that stretch of country, and happened, by good fortune, to be only a day's ride away when word reached him. Whitcomb, already held at the marshal's outpost, since Jasper had delivered him there the week before, was brought in to face the same proceeding. Adeline had expected to feel triumphant, watching Crow led away in irons. Instead, she felt mostly tired, the particular tiredness that settles into a body once a fear it's been carrying for months finally has somewhere else to go. "You could have killed him," she said to Cashas, that evening, sitting together on the porch steps in the last gray light of a day that had asked more of both of them than most days ever should. "Nobody would have blamed you, not after everything." "I know. Why didn't you?" He was quiet a long moment, turning the question, over the way he turned, over most things slow and careful. "Because I spent 5 years telling myself I was already the worst version of a man. he said finally. Believing what Crow said about me, even while I hated him for saying it. Believing I let 7 men die because I wasn't strong enough to stop it, when the truth was I refused to be part of something wrong, and it cost me anyway. He looked at her. If I'd killed him today out of anger, out of wanting it finished my own way instead of the right way, I'd have finally become the man he always said I was. And I've spent too many years fighting not to be that man to hand him the victory now. Adeline felt something in her chest go soft and full at once. Because she understood that, didn't she? Understood it in her own bones. The particular exhausting work of refusing to become what other people's cruelty tried to make of you. She'd done the same, in her own way, every single day since Copperline, every time she chose to keep working instead of disappearing, into the shame the town tried to hand her. Every time she chose kindness toward Cordelia instead of letting her own hardening heart close all the way over. I understand, she said. Simple. Complete. I know you do. He reached over, took her hand, the way he had a dozen times now in the weeks, since the barn fire, except this time something in the gesture felt less like comfort offered between two people surviving together, and more like something else entirely. Something neither of them had said out loud yet. Adeline, her name careful in his mouth. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm not saying it, because of today. Been true a while now, just didn't know how to say it without it sounding like something I only meant, because we're both still breathing. She waited, heart doing something complicated and fast in her chest. I love you, he said, plain. No flourish to it because that had never been his way, and somehow the plainness of it landed harder than any pretty words could have. Didn't marry you expecting to. Told myself that first morning this was a practical arrangement and nothing more. But somewhere between the biscuits and the coffee, and you throwing yourself down that ridge today to save a man who isn't even your blood, somewhere in all that I fell in love with my own wife. And I don't much know what to do with that except tell you plainly, and let you decide what you want to do with it. Adeline sat with it a moment, let it settle, because she'd felt it building too, hadn't she? In 100 small ways she'd been too careful, too frightened, to name out loud. The way she watched for his horse coming back, from the fence line every evening. The way his hand on hers had stopped feeling like comfort, and started feeling like something she reached for on purpose. I love you too, she said, quiet, certain. Didn't expect to either. Thought I'd buried that part of myself in the flood, along with everything else. A small, unsteady laugh. Turns out it just needed somewhere safe enough to come back up for air. He kissed her then, careful at first, like he was still asking permission even after everything they'd survived together. She kissed him back with none of that carefulness at all because she was done, finally, with being careful about the things that mattered. The trial, when it came, was a modest affair, held in the small territorial courthouse 2 towns over, presided over by a circuit judge who'd seen enough range wars and land disputes in his years riding that stretch of country that nothing about Ezekiel Crow's crimes particularly surprised him. Cashas testified, told the truth, finally, plainly, in front of a room that included several men, from Copperline who'd traveled to see the outcome for themselves. Men who, Adeline suspected, had come as much out of curiosity about the cursed widow as any real concern for justice. He told them about the supply train, about refusing to rob wounded soldiers of their medicine, about the crew getting caught 3 days later, while he was already miles away, already trying to build something honest out of the wreckage of a war that had asked ugly things of every man who lived through it. I've spent 5 years letting people believe the worst version of that story, he told the courtroom, voice steady despite what it clearly cost him to say it. Easier, in some ways, to let them think me a coward than to keep explaining myself to people who'd already made up their minds. I was wrong to let it stand. A man's reputation matters less than the truth, even when the truth is harder to carry. Adeline, sitting in the gallery, felt her throat go tight watching him say it. Because she understood exactly what that cost him, the particular vulnerability of finally setting down a lie you'd let define you, in front of the very people who'd been all too willing to believe the worst. When it was her turn, she told her own truth just as plainly. About Copperline. About Renner paid to beat her in the street, so the town would turn on her natural, and how none of it, not one bruise, not one whispered curse, had ever had anything to do with her at all. "I was told I brought bad luck to that town," she said, looking not at the judge, but out at the gallery, at the faces of Copperline she recognized. "Told I was cursed. Told, in 100 small cruel ways, that whatever happened to me, I'd earned it somehow just by existing in that place." Her voice didn't shake, though she'd half expected it to. "What actually happened is a man paid another man to hurt me, because hurting me was a cheaper way to hurt my husband than facing him honest. That's not a curse. That's just cruelty, dressed up so a whole town didn't have to look at what it really was." The silence that followed sat heavy in the courtroom. Somewhere in the gallery, someone from Copperline, Adeline never did learn who, let out a long breath that sounded almost like an apology nobody quite had the words to make properly. Crow was found guilty, sentenced to a territorial prison some 60 miles east, the kind of sentence that guaranteed, at his age, he'd likely never walk free again. Whitcomb, for his part in the deception, received a lesser sentence, softened somewhat by his eventual cooperation, and by Cashas, of all people, speaking on his behalf. "Why?" Adeline asked him afterward, riding back toward Ironwood in a wagon loaded, with more relief than either of them quite knew how to carry yet. "Why speak up for him, after everything?" "Because I forgave his debt once already," Cashas said. "Doesn't mean much, if I take it back the first time forgiveness gets tested." A pause. "Doesn't mean I trust him again. Just means I'm not going to be the man who only forgives when it's easy." She reached over, took his hand. "You're a strange kind of man, Cashas Reeve." "Strange how?" "Hardest man in the territory by reputation, and somehow the gentlest one I've ever known, underneath it." He didn't answer that, just held her hand a little tighter the rest of the way home, which was answer enough. Word of the trial traveled faster than either of them expected. By the time they reached Ironwood, the story had already reshaped itself the way stories do, passed mouth to mouth across the territory. No longer the cursed widow and the dangerous rancher, but something closer to the truth. A woman who'd survived a town's cruelty and a man's greed both, and stood up in a courtroom to say so plainly. A rancher who'd carried an unfair reputation for 5 years, and finally set it down. It didn't erase everything. There were still people in Copperline who'd likely go to their graves believing some version of the old story, because that's simply how some people were built, more comfortable with a curse they could point to than a truth that asked something harder of them. But it changed enough. Enough that when Cordelia's estranged husband rode out to Ironwood some weeks later, looking for his wife, he found not just Cashas and a rifle waiting for him, but Garrity and 2 other neighboring ranchers standing at the gate, as well, having heard through the same channels that carried every piece of news through that country and having decided on their own that they didn't much care for men who came looking to drag their wives back into houses that weren't safe for them. He left without incident. Left, in fact, rather quickly once he understood how many rifles stood between him and whatever he'd come intending to do. Cordelia, watching from the porch, let out a breath she'd clearly been holding the better part of an hour. "He's really gone? Really gone?" Adeline confirmed. "Is it always going to feel like this?" Cordelia's voice was small. "Like I'm waiting for the next time?" Adeline thought about that a long moment, choosing her words carefully, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be handed easy comfort that didn't quite match the truth. "Some of it fades," she said finally. "Not all at once. Not completely, maybe ever, but it gets easier to carry. And you get stronger carrying it whether you mean to or not." She put a hand on Cordelia's shoulder. "You're not the same woman who rode in here half-broken a few months back. You know that, don't you?" Cordelia managed a small, watery smile. "I'm getting there. That's all any of us are doing." The years that followed weren't, without their hardships, no stretch of frontier country ever was, not truly, not for people trying to build something honest out of hard ground and harder history. There were dry seasons that tested the herd. There was a winter some years on that took 2 hands they could ill afford to lose. There was grief, ordinary and expected, the kind that comes simply from living long enough to bury people you love. But Ironwood held, grew even in the slow, steady way that things built on honest ground tend to grow. Obadiah stayed on until his own hands grew too stiff for the work, and even then he stayed anyway, content to sit on the porch most afternoons offering opinions nobody had asked for about how things ought to be done. Jasper grew into the kind of steady, capable man that Cashas had once been at his age, minus the years of hard living that had shaped Cashas's own path. Cordelia, in time, took over managing a good portion of the household herself, teaching newer hands the way Adeline had once taught her, passing the particular kindness she'd been shown forward into hands that needed it just as badly. And on a particular evening many years later, Cashas, gray-haired by then, his hands slower, but his eyes still holding that same steady watchfulness she'd first seen across 30 feet of dirt in Copperline, Adeline and Cashas sat together on the porch of a house that had been rebuilt and rebuilt again into something far grander than the sparse, function-over-comfort place she'd first walked into as a stranger, with nothing but a torn dress and a tarnished ring. Cordelia's own children played somewhere in the yard below, laughter carrying up on the evening air, and Adeline watched them, with the particular ache of a woman who'd never had children of her own, but had, somehow, built a family anyway, out of strangers who'd needed a place to land. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Cashas, the same question she'd asked him once before, years ago, in a different season of their lives. "Marrying me that day? Bringing me out here?" "Not for one single second." His voice had gone rougher with age, but the certainty in it hadn't dulled a bit. "Best decision I ever made, and I've made a fair number of decisions in this life, good and bad both. Even with everything it cost us, Crow, the barn. All of it, the cost was always coming, one way or another." He took her hand, the way he had 1,000 times, over the years, the gesture worn smooth and familiar now like a path walked, so often it had shaped itself into the ground. "You just gave people a reason to stand against it instead of just enduring it quiet. That's worth any price it asked of us." She leaned into him, tired in the good way now, the way that comes from a long life well spent, rather than a long life merely survived. "I love you," she said. "Don't think I ever say that enough. You say it plenty." A small smile, the kind that still, after all these years, made something warm move through her chest. "I love you too, Adeline. Have since long before I had the sense to say it out loud." They sat like that as the light faded over the valley, two people who'd once been strangers bound together by desperation and practicality, who'd built, slowly and stubbornly, something neither of them had believed themselves capable of anymore. Not just safety, not just survival, a home, a real one, earned the hard way, the only way that ever seems to last. And somewhere below them, in the yard that had once smelled of smoke and fear, laughter rose up into the evening air, proof, if either of them had still needed it, after all these years, that the worst a place and a past can hand a person doesn't have to be the last word. Sometimes, if you're patient enough, and honest enough, and brave enough to keep choosing each other, through every hard season that comes, it's only the beginning of a much better story.